I think the second foundational principle in why God does not seem to hear or answer our prayers is a simple principle that we overlook. If I hire a young person to cut my lawn and offer them, let's say, $25, and he chooses not to cut the lawn, having agreed to it, does he still have a right to the $25? Do I have an obligation to pay him when he has not upheld his end of the bargain? God has promise after promise after promise to his people, people that have come into his family through Jesus Christ. But most of those promises are conditional, and they're conditional on a very ugly word. That ugly word is obedience. God lays out certain principles in the Bible on how things work and how they work on our behalf. If we follow those principles, our life tends to improve. If we disregard those principles, our lives tend to fall into chaos and into trouble more often than not. Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things I ask you to do?" Here's a question. You call yourself a Christian? If you never ever, as a professing Christian, ever do a single thing that God asks you to do, are you really a Christian? I believe a relationship with God requires certain action. And this isn't obedience to a list of rules. Jesus made it very clear what the distinction was between rules and principles. Somebody came to him and asked him what is the most important of the 10 Commandments. And he said, none of them. He said, the most important principle is this: love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. Those are principles. They're not rules. If you get the principles right, the rules are going to take care of themselves. You're not going to commit murder. You're not going to profane God. You're not going to steal your neighbor's wife because you love God and you love your neighbor. So God lays out any number of principles in the Bible on how things work on our behalf, and then he attaches blessings to being obedient to those principles. Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy." In the Lord's Prayer, he says, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." And then he goes on at the end of that prayer to say, if you don't forgive other people, why would you expect God to forgive you? The blessing, and this is just one example of mercy, in order to not be forgiven, but to internalize that forgiveness, we need to practice forgiveness. Put down our scorecard. And once we stop keeping score, we're going to inherit peace, and we're going to learn what mercy looks like from the inside out. The Bible's full of rules, and full of principles, and full of promises. But Jesus tells us, once we learn the principles, we should grow out of the rule book just by practicing the principles. When I got my driver's license at about age 16, I needed to see that sign in front of a school saying speed limit 15 miles an hour when children are present. At my advanced age, I don't need a sign to tell me to slow down. If I see kids on the side of the road, whether I'm in a school zone or not, my foot comes off the gas pedal because I don't want to hurt a kid. And that's the difference between rules and principles. We internalize things as we grow up. And what Christians, I believe, need to internalize if we want to really inherit God's peace and promise and understand that he is hearing our prayer and answering, we need to look to the principles and say, what do I need to be obedient to in order to reap the harvest of blessings that God promises me? And there's just a ton of them in the Bible, but nearly all of them are conditional on our following the principles that God lays out. Jesus tells a story in Matthew 7. He said, not everybody that calls me Lord, Lord is going to enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. There's a word for doing God's will, and it's called obedience. And then he tells a story about two men, one who is obedient and practices godly principles. It's like building a house on a solid foundation. The other, who doesn't internalize God's principles and doesn't follow them, is like a man building his house on sand. When the storm comes, it's going to get blown away. So I think that, and this is something we don't hear from the pulpits very often. We have a lot of soft sermons, unfortunately, but at some point people need to understand, myself included, that if I really want to claim God's blessings and be confident that he's hearing and answering my prayer, I need to look in the mirror and say, okay, what should I be doing? What has God asked me to do, and what principles am I overlooking here? Once I started doing that a number of years ago, my life started changing. It changed for the better, and I have no doubt any longer that God hears my prayer and he answers. He doesn't always answer me on my terms or my timing, and sometimes his answer is sit still and wait, but he does answer, and it's always for my good.